I am going to, in this talk, try and cover some key variables that have emerged within the gopher tortoise conservation community to try and help us understand what a viable population should mean across the entire range of the population. And so one of the foci of my talks is to try and show you the science behind some numbers that have emerged that are guiding all the states in their attempts to document where current viable populations might exist in the landscape. So I want to walk you through that just so we're all up to speed on that particular topic. The science community has also been challenged with the notion of recognizing that we know we can't have just one population representing tortoises in the entire state of Alabama. That's too risky. We all recognize from population ecology that we need to have replicate populations. So I want to briefly summarize some discussions that have been made with two different models that are currently available to us to try and help states determine how many viable populations we need within each state so that we share the conservation burden across the geographic range of the tortoise. And then I want to briefly discuss some ideas that have emerged in this discussion of sort of what it's a population, how many do we need, that deals with the places where we have tortoises but they might not be viable populations. And I want to briefly discuss the concepts that have emerged in that discussion that indicate that we're currently presenting primary and secondary support populations as parts of the conservation discussion, parts of the conservation planning that deal with these areas that have tortoises but they might not be viable populations, and what our plans ought to do for those situations. And everything that I'm going to talk to you today about emerged from first a series of workshops that the Gopher Tortoise Council organized. So when I talk about the science community, it emerged from that organization. But that organization also has representatives from all the non-game offices of all the states as well. And those officers were present at these workshops and essentially took over them to address the issues that we're facing today. And the origin of those issues come from the petition to list the gopher tortoise as well as a whole bunch of other species, many of which are associated with the tortoises and in that tortoise habitat. And so whatever we do for the tortoises likely is to help us to deal with that very lengthy list. But essentially what the Fish and Wildlife Service said to the states is, you have all independently done wonderful things to try and save tortoises, but there's no consistency across state lines about what you consider population to be and how you go about determining whether you've got populations or not, and sort of what your overall goals are. And so they sort of put the word out early on that they expected a greater consistency in the efforts for conservation. And based on these GTC, Gopher Tortoise Council workshops and the things that have emerged since then, what we're going to do with the next series of talks is sort of bring you up to speed on where, again, the science and conservation community is on making a more consistent definition of what a viable population is, and how we might go about determining where these populations are going to exist and how many we need for saving this organism in the landscapes that we've got. So my talk is going to introduce the 3 R's. This comes from the mindset of the Fish and Wildlife Service. What they want to see in a plan that would cause them to not list the thing under the federal guidelines is these things that they refer to as 3 R's. One is representation. They want to see whatever conservation plans emerge that it preserves tortoises in all the representative habitats that tortoises might occupy. So I've got one of many of the different versions of ecoregion maps that one might pull off of the web. And what we're indicating here for representation relative to the 3 R's is that within the range of the gopher tortoise, we've got greens, we've got yellows, we've got browns, and the conservation plan has to maintain gopher tortoises in each of those colored regions if the gopher tortoise evolved there. We want to make sure that that plan covers that component of the landscape. So we got to make sure our plans retain these organisms across the ecoregions. You're going to have different terms. We might use the term habitat here. Eventually we're going to talk about conservation units. Those have to have representation across all the units that we might have. We also need to make sure that there's redundancy, that we have, again, more than just one basket out there, and so we need to have replicate populations within each of the ecoregions or the conservation units, because we know, again, from simple population biology, simple demography, we want to make sure that if one population blinks out, we have others from which we might rescue these other populations. So we need to make sure there's sufficient replication of populations within each of these units, and then the thing that I'm going to spend most of my time on is this notion of resiliency. Each of the populations that we have, we want to make sure that it's resilient enough to withstand unpredictable ecological perturbations, things like diseases going through, things like hurricanes coming through and transforming our landscape. And so from, again, this textbook graph that I've got here, we want to make sure that our populations are the solid blue line, that we get them up to a level where no matter what happens for the foreseeable future, that population is going to be there. And we want to make sure it's not the dash line, a line that does not reach a level that can withstand these kind of perturbations. And just to let the cat out of the bag earlier, one of you came to me before lunch and said, "Man, I hope you give me an uplifting story to tell you." But at the moment, I think what we're going to be dealing with is the harsh reality of what we're looking at. And I think we're going to see that in the state of Alabama, we have the challenge that right now, all of the biological data that has been summarized and published in the literature suggests that we might be on this dash line, where we have animals in the landscape, but not sufficient numbers and not interacting with each other enough to maintain those populations long term. So from this, again, where the challenge was to determine, well, if the target is to have resilient populations, viable populations long term into the future, what is that? And these numbers have emerged from the science that evolved. We're going to need to have geographically contiguous areas with at least 250 adults in that area. Those adults have to reach a minimum density of 0.4 tortoises per hectare or 0.16 per acre. And that in those areas we need to have some evidence that there's reproduction going on, that there are juveniles that are growing and reaching adult stage. At this point, the science community has, again, listed these as criteria that you have to present to be able to document that you might have a viable population. And so here's where these numbers come from, just so we understand, again, the scientific background. I'm going to start first with looking at this estimate of 250 individuals creating a population. That comes from two sources. One is a computer projection model, and the other is a landscape analysis. And we're going to see here in a second that both of those seem to point to the same number. And so that seems to suggest to us that we have a relatively solid, from a statistical standpoint, target there for what a population is. Now, this population viability analysis, I'm going to skim through it because it's a bunch of math and a bunch of computer programming that we don't need to spend our time on too much here. But it comes from work that was done out of Savannah River Ecology Lab by Tracy Tuberville. It's in this particular publication available online. And essentially what you do in this particular type of analysis is to take what information you have about populations, enter it into a computer program that can help you forecast based on that information what populations are likely to do in the future, knowing that there's variation in how things happen. The fact that populations have organisms of various ages, so you create a table with age, And for each age, you try and develop information that tells you how likely it is that an individual of age 1 is going to survive to age 2. And so if you have an estimate of that, this program will take that in. You also have to have an estimate, if you're in age 1, how likely it is that you're going to leave offspring before you leave that age class and go to the next one. And essentially, population demography is those two competing things. You're losing animals due to loss due to mortality, but you're gaining them by reproduction. And so in this particular model, where they looked across the range of the gopher tortoise and noticed that the variables that you would input for this demography, survivorship and reproductive, age-specific reproduction, changes depending on where you are in the distribution of the organism. So it noticed that we needed to separate the geographical range into the periphery. That's all of Alabama in this particular scenario. They have a central range, the green range, and then the southern range, and that was necessary because if you look at the age of reproduction, how long does it take you to reach sexual maturity? It changes depending on the region. So at the top of this table, I've indicated they're under optimal habitat for the periphery. That's some data that came out of my lab looking at the Connecticut National Forest. We're looking at the growth rates of individuals there, and it takes females about 20 years to reach sexual maturity. It takes males about 17 years. The information below that was programmed into this particular study that we're summarizing. That is a guesstimate of what happens in relatively poor habitat in the periphery. This is numbers that the authors came up with. They passed it around the gopher tortoise community and said, hey, do these look reasonable? And we all said, yeah, if you add about 3 more years, that probably represents the difference that you might expect based on a difference between an animal being in really fine quality habitat versus marginal habitat. And as you go down through the other portions of that table, again, there's field data for the central region to suggest that in marginal habitats, things are maturing about 17 years for females, 15 for males. There was an estimate of what that might be for optimal habitat entered into the model. And then finally, the folks in the University of South Florida have come up with estimates for the southern part of the range that, again, indicate that the tortoises mature much more rapidly there. The reason for that is obvious. South Florida, there's never winter. And just like humans, the tortoises are out and active year-round. They're foraging year-round, and so they can invest in growth. By the time you get up here into Alabama, there's no way these things are active after about November and come up about March or April. So that biological reality was put into this particular model. They also took a look at the fact that the reproductive output changes regionally. Up here in the northern part of the range, clutch size of 5 is pretty standard, not much variation around that. By the time you get to South Florida, it's up to an average of 8, and there's great variation around that particular estimate. And so we can enter that into the computer demographic models. And then finally, we need to know something about survivorship. And this was entered into the model as an estimate for all regions simultaneously. So this part of the model says we don't really know much about survivorship actually, and it took what information was available to them and plugged it in the same for all regions. And it's suggesting we have lots of studies that put radio transmitters onto baby tortoises and discovered that you don't see them again next year. So the table up there says 96% mortality for a hatchling tortoise born in this part of the world roughly about September 1st. Most of those things don't live to see the next year. And that's consistent across the range. The other values that are placed in there are pretty much guesses that the community, the science community gave to them. They asked us to guesstimate how many 1 to 2 year old animals would survive long enough to be a 2 to 4 year old animals. We guessed about 50%. And how many would survive from 4 years old to maturity. We know that to be a very large number. 97% of those, once you reach a size where your shell hardens, those animals are pretty much in the landscape for a long period of time. And in this particular model, based on, again, the expert experience, we suggested, hey, 60 years might be the the top lifespan of the tortoise. And again, you put this into the computer model. You put variation around these, so you guess how much variation there is, and the computer model is going to assess that, that level of uncertainty in the model projections. Plus, this particular model also imposes catastrophic events. So it looks at what would happen if there's something that comes through and wipes out large numbers of your animals. And the output of the model looks like this. And to walk us through this, what we're looking on as in the x-axis down there at the bottom, we're telling the computer, hey, start out with 20 animals and tell me, project what happens with that population in the future. And so on the y-axis, you have the probability of extinction. And so at 20 individuals as a starting population, the model is saying, man, they're all going to go extinct. There's not enough individuals. When you go up to 40, if you're from South Alabama, it gets to be a little rosier, but still a large number of those populations in our computer projections are going extinct. But when you get to 250 animals, if you're from the southern part of the range or the central part of the range, now we're down to an extinction probability that's low, 1 to 5%. And as conservation biologists, that's the level of risk we're generally willing to take. We're generally in the 1 to 5% probability of extinction is what we're shooting for. So 250 in this projection model is the first population size that comes up with populations that seem to survive long enough to be worthy of investing our conservation efforts. But notice the red line up there. That's us in Alabama. It's still way high up there. And even at 2,500, if you look at some of the other output of this particular model, it suggests that regardless of how many animals they programmed in there, eventually all these computer models went extinct in the long term. And so there's still, from that I'm going to give you this word of caution that again, lots of what we're basing our decisions on today come from this particular model, but we should recognize that there's a dilemma in that the model does not seem to find for any of these populations one that will live longer than about 200 years. And there's those of us who've dealt with the gopher tortoise from a field biology perspective, we're uncomfortable with that outcome of the model. It causes us to think that maybe the data that went into it need to be improved. But that represents one estimate. So that 250 is just the one that's going to save the central portion, and it's going to save the southern portion, but not necessarily our part of the distribution. But there was a second mechanism that was used, again, to try and estimate what is the size of a tortoise population. And it represents a landscape level approach. And I'm going to try and show you the concept of this in this cartoon. So suppose we're looking at tortoises. The tortoises have burrows, and so suppose we're God and we have an exact knowledge of where every tortoise burrow is. And suppose there's only 2 populations of tortoises, and there they are. But we as a population biologist, we don't have that infinite knowledge. We simply want to go out there and study the tortoise. And so what you do is to do what I did, for example, in the places where I've developed population studies. I just said, I want to study tortoises. I don't want to waste my time in places where there are no tortoises. So when I set up a study plot, I go to some place where people say, hey, there's a lot of tortoises here, and I set up a plot. And within that plot, I know the surface area of it, and I know the number of burrows, and therefore the number of tortoises that are in those burrows. But I might have gone a little farther. I might have made a bigger plot, right? And if I were to do that, I would still center that bigger plot on somewhere where there's lots of tortoises. And notice that as the plot gets bigger, we get a bigger surface area, we also get more tortoises in those 2 plots that we labeled A. And that's going to be true for the plot that's of size A3 up to B1. Each one of those, we're getting a bigger and bigger area, and we're getting more and more individual burrows and therefore tortoises in that particular process. But if we were foolish enough to say, hey, let's continue this on, let's make an even bigger plot and see if I can find more tortoises, That would not be true for B2, wouldn't be true for B3, wouldn't be true for B4, and it wouldn't add more burrows or tortoises until we had a plot that was that big. And if we continued this process, again, we would suddenly get to a place where we increase our effort, but we don't get any return by having more individuals to study. And this particular method says, hey, if you look at all of the A plots and plot it on a simple plot where you're looking at how big your plot is on the x-axis and how many tortoise burrows or tortoises you have on the y-axis, it's a linear increase for all the boxes that I labeled A until you get to the ones that I labeled B, and then the size is increasing, but the number of animals is not increasing. And this particular method says, hey, look for this breakpoint where you get a linear increase, and when it stops and suddenly plateaus off, that tells you the size of a tortoise population. And it's not you as a scientist imposing that on the tortoises. The tortoises went out there and created their own populations, and we as scientists discover what that population is. And so it turns out if you do that for gopher tortoises, this is some data that came out of my lab, went to many published studies, went to many of the tortoise study sites that my lab has looked at over the years, and we simply looked at how big the area was and how many tortoise burrows there were. And sure enough, you get a plot where, again, well, on the x-axis we've got area, on the y-axis we've got numbers of burrows, and there on the left-hand side there's a linear increase up to a point where it plateaus off. And there's a statistical technique that allows you to find those two lines that I put in there, the top one being the most important line. That's the point at which the relationship suddenly goes flat, and that suggests that 440 burrows, and if you use a conversion factor, it's about 240 tortoises, are present in these styles of populations. Again, the tortoise decided where this breakpoint is. We didn't as scientists. So tortoises tend to be aggregated out there in nature based on this, and it's about 240 individuals. That's a pleasingly close number to the one we got from the demographic modeling procedure. So both of those efforts seem to converge on this number, and that's why as a conservation group we are suggesting that if we're looking for viable populations, we need at least 250 individuals. That's based on adult animals. It's very difficult to find the juvenile burrows, so this is based on survey work where we're focusing on the adult component of the populations. Okay, so we've got that particular number. Let's look next at this notion that suggests, yeah, but we don't want just 250 individuals. We want to make sure that they're at a particular density in order to demonstrate that they're viable. And so we know that tortoises are highly social organisms. And so I'm going to go through a study that came out of my lab that attempt to look at the effect of population density on the movement patterns of tortoises, and we're using that to estimate the point at which density is so low that the social structure of the organisms changes in a way that might suggest that they're no longer viable. And so we're going to look at these 6 sites in trying to understand this component of what emerges from the science. And so starting on the east side, on the right side of here, the WT, that stands for Wade Tract. Old growth longleaf pine forest in South Georgia, as close to pristine habitat as we're going to get anywhere. The folks that manage that site burn every other year in growing season fires, and the tortoise density there is phenomenally high. So very high habitat quality, very high tortoise density. As we go west, you get into the GG, that's Green Grove, pretty much the same thing. That's Itchaway's property. Very high habitat quality, frequent fires on the order of about every 3 years there. Very widely spaced, big old trees, and the tortoise density there is exceptionally high. As we continue to go west, we bump into the CNF, that's the Conecuh National Forest. This is a working forest. Habitat quality has to be affected by the fact that there's multi-use there. So the habitat quality is marked in the middle of the ruler that we use for habitat quality. And therefore population density of tortoises there is reduced. It's at a mid-level. I'm going to jump to the CS next, the farthest west. That's Camp Shelby, also managed for tortoises, but also for multiple purposes. So habitat quality is in the middle of that particular ruler, and the tortoise density is in the middle. And then as we go back east, there's MC, that's Mobile County, that's working lands. At the time it was operated by international paper companies at the particular time that we did this study. Therefore, from a tortoise perspective, the habitat quality is poor and the density is quite low. And then finally, the DC in the center is the Dixon Center. I was challenged to find a place that as a field biologist, I would look at and say, man, this is about as crappy as you can get and still have tortoises present. And so the Dixon Center actually is quite good land, but I found a place on their property that hadn't been burned in forever. The habitat quality was poor. I was surprised to find any tortoises yet there, and yet there they were. And so I wanted to get that end of the range of the spectrum. And what we did on each of these sites is to mark all the burrows. We attempted to mark every individual in the population. We wanted to get as close to a total coverage of the population as we could. And so we scoped the burrows, determined whether there's tortoise in there, put a trap on it to try and capture the organism. We had enough money to buy enough radio transmitters to put a radio on all of the individuals in each population that we studied. And then through an entire season of activity, we followed those organisms to try and understand their movement patterns within a single year. We also had digital camera technology. So we put a camera at every individual adult female and recorded the males that came to visit that individual, so that we had additional information besides just the regular telemetry, where essentially you go out once a day and say, well, it's here, but you don't know what happened to that animal the rest of the day. This allowed us to add additional information on the movement patterns. And our goal was to, again, understand something about the home range size, what its relationship is to tortoise density. So here's how those data appear if we put it in a boring scientific publication. We, on our x-axis, have the tortoise density on the x-axis, and so it's from low density on the left to high density on the right. That simultaneously means from poor habitat quality to good habitat quality. And then we're looking at something about the area, the home range size that's needed for average individuals in each of these areas. The dotted line represents males. We know males move farther than females. And the solid lines represent the females. And let's start here at the far right. That's the wade tract, again, very high quality. We had a question about how much space do we need for an individual tortoise, and we didn't give them the answer. The answer is it's about 2 to 3 acres. About a hectare is what tortoises need on average for very high quality sites. If you're going to manage the lands so that it's the way tortoises have evolved, then that's about as much space as the individuals need. But as you go to the more marginal quality sites, home ranges expand. So here's Connecticut National Forest. That's a significant increase for both males and females in their movement patterns over a season of activities. And we've, using additional information that are additional data that I'm not going to summarize here, we know that what the animals are doing is recognizing that, hey, there's not as many neighbors. It's farther for me to go to visit my neighbor, but they're willing to do that. And so they expand their home range in order to maintain the same site of social structure that they have for Green Grove and the Wade Tract. And when you get to Camp Shelby, those animals are really wandering quite far, but they're doing that to maintain the social structure that they have for places like the Wade Tract or Green Grove. But then as you get even poorer habitat quality, as the density goes even farther down, the animals change their behavior. Suddenly they collapse their home ranges down to where they know where a single neighboring individual is, essentially, and that's your entire social structure for the entire year. And rather than having this very complex social network that you have in these other places, and again, that's true at both of these low density sites. So that 0.4 tortoise density for the definition of what a viable population is comes from these data. And it's the point at which we think the social structure changes so that you're no longer getting enough reproductive effort to maintain populations the way we do in Green Grove, Connecticut National Forest, potentially Camp Shelby. So that's where that number comes from. But we've also indicated that we want, if we're going to have a viable population, to make sure that there's some recruitment going on. And admittedly here, the data that we have to present to you is pretty simplistic, but it's exactly what you'd expect it to be. You want to be able to go out in your areas and to point to the fact that you're finding juvenile tortoises among the cutest organisms on Earth. So if you're ever in a place where you have a chance where the animals have hatched out, that's one worth looking for. And so essentially we want to make sure that if you got to claim to have a viable population, you need to have some data on either the size of the burrows, which represents the size of the tortoises there, or better yet, some information on the size of the tortoises. And we're trying to make sure that we pick places where you have some evidence of juveniles, upper left panel here, and we would not want to claim that a site like the lower right one, where we've got a bunch of adults present there, but there's no evidence that they're recruiting. We would not want to claim viability for those kinds of situations. So those are where the numbers defining what a viable population is come from, and again, the states have pretty much agreed that they're going to concentrate on those numbers in trying to assess each of the states. And we want to come to grips with this question of how much redundancy. Once you've got one population, how many more do we need in order to suggest that the animal is secure for the long term? And admittedly, our ideas here are rudimentary, and so I'm going to just present to you two ideas, and I can't point to which one I think the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to prefer, or which one any particular state should use. But there's two ideas that emerge. One is I'm going to call a democratic model, and the other I'm going to call a demographic model. And so let's start with the democratic model, which comes from a Fish and Wildlife Service employee in the state of Georgia, Don M., if you know him. The state people from Georgia went to him and said, hey, if we want to deal with this redundancy, how do we deal with it? And he suggested that we simply start with the notion that we know we need more than one population. We could go to two, and he said, well, I'm embarrassed by that. Let's try three, and he said, that's the point at which I, as a conservation biologist, would say, well, I'm satisfied with that. It's not what I want, but let's just use that as a starting point. And he then said, he said, if you've got conservation areas, then let's look for three populations in each of those conservation areas as a starting point. But then let's adjust those, because some of the conservation units are likely to be bigger than others, so let's adjust those up. And some are going to be smaller, so those might be adjusted down. But in particular, we know that there's some regions where politically and logistically, we know that there's just unlikely going to be any conservation lands available to us. And so let's make sure that whatever the method we use can adjust things for that. And so he suggested, yeah, if you got a big area with good tortoise soils, but there's no conservation partners willing to join in, then let's allow ourselves the possibility of adjusting that one down while compensating for that by adjusting others up. And so he says, if you've got a big area, let's go with more than three. If you've got lots of conservation opportunities in a particular area, let's adjust those up as well. But using this as just a starting point to develop targets for how many populations would fulfill this need to have redundancy in the conservation efforts. And so that's one model that's out there, and we're about to see the state of Georgia has relied heavily, and at least initially, on that particular model to develop their plans. But we all just got back from a second symposium that was an attempt to look at a different way to deal with redundancy, and that's this demographic model. And it goes back to the Tuberville model that we just summarized. And it says, let's use that information as our best science to try and build on that notion the number of populations that you would need to retain at least one viable population some foreseeable time in the future. And we're using 200 years as our consistent target for that. And so in this particular method, you let the computer determine, given your willingness to accept risk that you might lose them all, you input that into the model, and it tells you how many populations you might need to protect that. And at the moment, I'm just going to tell you that the numbers that come out of this model are scary high. And I don't want to go any further than that because the folks who participated in that pointed out the problems with the data that went into the demography. And so there was some discussion that led to us not being capable of pointing to one or the other as being the one that would guide how we might choose our targets for the redundancy component. So let's also indicate that we recognize also that we've got lots of landscape where there are tortoises present, but there might not be enough of them present to become a viable population, or we might have enough of them, but their density might be so low as to fail to be viable at that level. And so the conservation group has discussed this notion that we need to have this concept of support populations, and we're suggesting that we consider among all the states creating primary support populations, things that are 50 to 249 individuals in the population. And essentially what we're saying is that these look like opportunities to alter the landscape in a way to enhance it for tortoises, because these look like they're populations that would like to increase and would eventually reach the levels that we have created as targets. So through effective habitat management, the population might be allowed to rebound on their own in those particular areas. Or if it looks like the area is good, but it might take forever for the tortoises to respond, these are areas where we might consider managing a small area so that it's pristine for tortoises, and then penning those tortoises, moving them all to the density that we need, and create a viable, an apparently viable population